everyone. Happy Monday and happy belated Veterans Day to all of those who served our community and our community. I sound like a police officer, our country. And for all those who still continue to serve, despite the fact that you're working for a government that literally doesn't care about you and a president who fucks up sacred and time-honored military ceremonies every fucking time. So, Stephanie, I don't know if you saw the footage this weekend. Biden was laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldiers on Saturday at the Arlington National Cemetery. And it's like a very solemn and sacred ceremony for Veterans Day. But as usual, he was totally fucking lost. He had no idea what he was supposed to be doing. And he had to be directed where to stand by a US service member who was at the memorial. Like, if you watch the video, you can see he puts the wreath on the stand and then he just kind of gets this blank look and he turns around and he clearly doesn't know what he's supposed to do next or where he's supposed to go. And this service member literally has to direct him to go stand next to Kamala. Like, it's just beyond embarrassing at this point. And I feel bad for every member of the military, former and current, and for the families of all those who sacrificed their lives for our country, that you and your ceremonies are constantly being disrespected by our bumbling, geriatric, senile, fucktard president.
Well, nothing's worse than when he was checking his watch when the 13 service members were, coming back to America from Afghanistan. Like, this guy just screws up every ceremony.
Yeah, it's just so fucking disrespectful. And like, speaking of him and government nonsense and not giving a fuck about America, like last week we talked about how the new House Speaker Mike Johnson wants to use the money from the Inflation Reduction Act that was supposed to go to hiring the 87,000 new IRS agents, and how he wants to give that 14 billion or 14.5, whatever it is, billion in aid to Israel. And like we talked about this, there's been bipartisan agreement in Congress on providing aid to Israel. And it's clear Biden's in support of this because he's the one who asked for this money in the first place. And he's remained pretty firm in his stance to support Israel. But apparently that support is suddenly contingent on, surprise, surprise, money going to Ukraine. So I read an article in the Washington Examiner that came out, I think Friday, and it was talking about how Biden and several Senate Democrats are now refusing to go forward with this $14 billion aid to Israel that Biden asked the House to pass. And the reason is because they didn't approve the $61 billion that he asked for in assistance to Ukraine, and he wants them funded at the same time. And we talked also last week about how Mike Johnson wants to combine funding for Ukraine with funding for the US border wall. And again, totally reasonable, and I'm on board with that. But according to this article, it said, quote, Biden insisted that the aid to Israel be passed in one big bill with aid to Ukraine. He was so adamant that he threatened to veto any aid to Israel that was not paired with money for Ukraine. Republicans suspect that Biden took the opportunity of a new conflict in Israel to try to win Ukraine aid by attaching it to the more popular measure, end quote. And the article also brought up how this past Wednesday, a White House official told Politico that Biden, quote, will not accept a standalone Israel-only bill that fails to demonstrate America's commitment to standing up to Putin and his brutal aggression, and that doesn't provide urgently needed humanitarian assistance, end quote. Basically saying that any Israel bill that fails to include money for Ukraine is a no-go for the White House. And Stephanie, like, this is Monday, and it's 5 days away from the November 17th deadline for another possible federal government shutdown on Friday. And you've got House Republicans saying they're not going to back down on their refusal to continue supporting Ukraine unless Biden first agrees to secure the US-Mexico border. And now you have Biden coming up with this shit. So like, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out.
Well, and it's like, how much more obvious can it be that Ukraine has leverage over Biden? Like, you don't get our funding, then those recordings that we have of you accepting bribes are going public. I mean, it's so in your face obvious, but everyone just ignores it. And as usual, the Democrats are going to hold out until the final hour, and then the Republicans will cave. I guarantee it happens every time. And the Democrats always end up getting what they want. But Biden not accepting a single standalone bill for Israel is total bullshit. And this is the thing that Mike Johnson and the Republicans want to change. They think that everything should be a standalone bill, and it should, because the only reason you'd be against that is if you have something you're trying to sneak in that wouldn't get approved on its own due to its merits, like Ukraine. I mean, 500,000 lives, 500,000 lives have been lost because of this ongoing war in Ukraine. And it's time to like accept like they lost, save our resources for the very likely scenario of World War III breaking out, which I mean, it's pretty much unfolding right in front of us. But speaking of Israel, I wanted to talk about something that I heard the other day on the Daily Wire, because I think this sheds a light on like how deep these foreign issues go within our country and with everything we talked about, last week. So the Daily Wire podcast discussed a report from the Network Contagion Research Institute. And this report found that there is a direct correlation between foreign funding and anti-Semitism, suppression of speech, and anti-American sentiment on campuses across the United States. They also found a direct correlation between anti-Semitism and funding from Middle Eastern regimes. So get this, from 2015 to 2020, colleges that took money from the Middle Eastern regimes had 300% more anti-Semitic incidents than those that didn't accept funding from the Middle East. Like, how clear cut is that? Yeah. And this is what's really surprising. Well, it's not surprising, but it's just like in your face. At least 200 American colleges and universities illegally withheld information about accepting $13 billion from foreign regimes. And that was only between the years of 2015 and 2019. So imagine how much they've accepted prior to that. And yeah. I think that this really explains what is happening on these college campuses and everything we talked about last week, where it's like all of a sudden everyone is chanting that they want to murder Jews and all this crazy stuff. It's like, well, this explains it. Look at where they're getting their funding. And that's not the only thing that came forward. So remember last week how we talked about Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib getting censured because she was chanting, from the river to the sea, which clearly means ending Jewish people in Israel. Well, the Glenn Beck show reported that 7 members of her staff have ties to Hamas, like to the actual terrorist group. And so
are you surprised?
I'm not surprised, but what I think was like an aha moment for me when I heard that was she's just one member of our government that has like 7 different people on that we know about with ties to a terrorist group that wants to destroy America. Imagine how many other government officials and staff have ties to various terrorist groups or ties to, our adversaries like China. Like, clearly we know they've infiltrated the universities. Well, guess where all these elites went? They went to these universities, politicians, people at every level of government, but also people at every level of the economy, like the elites that run the country, the banking system, Wall Street, or, these mega corporations. And so it was just kind of like eye-opening, because I always look at like the Congresswoman, for example, but I didn't even think about all of their staff and how many of them are like directly linked to this. So it's really concerning.
Yeah, and that's why I'm curious to see if more Jewish people in power, like those that have the money, are they gonna stand up and start speaking out? Because like we've talked about before, they run Hollywood, they're prominent in the banking industry, all these high-level professional fields in politics, and they have a lot of control when it comes to where the money goes, especially with colleges and universities. So I don't know if you saw this, but I was happy to see an article that more than 1,600 Jewish Harvard alumni are threatening to withdraw their donations if Harvard doesn't take action to address all this anti-Semitism on campus. And I guess Columbia University announced on Friday that it suspended 2 pro-Palestinian student groups from campus because of their anti-Semitic protests. But let's be honest here. Like, these schools are taking action because of the threat of millionaire and billionaire donors pulling funding. It has nothing to do with actually caring about anti-Semitism. It's about the fucking money.
Yeah. And it might be canceling a protest or this or that, but it doesn't target the main issue of the indoctrination that's so embedded in the curriculum and in the staff at these universities that are basically like brainwashing young people to come out with a very specific view.
Yeah. And it's just like, I'm so curious to see how this transpires. If they actually do pull funding, are these empty threats, or are they actually going to follow through with this shit? Because
Well,
these are out of control.
you know what's really interesting that I didn't realize because I wasn't born at the time, but during World War II and Hitler's reign and like everything that he was doing, the New York Times, among like all the other major publications, they denied it. They were saying there is nothing happening over there. And there were a lot of pro-Nazi journalists. And when you look side by side with the pro-Palestinians and like denying the October 7th massacre and all these things, it's so similar to what happened with the Nazis. And so it'll be interesting to see moving forward, like if these people are going to be called out on it, if these newspapers will ever like admit that they were wrong. Like, I don't know. It's scary how eerily similar the events are.
Yeah. And if we didn't have basically social media and the internet, we wouldn't know what the fuck would be going on anyway.
Right.
So yeah. But let's talk more about our idiot president. So this week, he's going to be meeting with none other than Xi Jinping on Wednesday in San Francisco. And I guess this is going to be like only the second time that they've met in person during Biden's presidency. And Stephanie, like, do you think that Gavin Newsom, the dictator of California, AKA upcoming presidential nominee that refuses to admit he's actually prepping for the presidency, who spent a week in China a couple weeks ago on his presidential campaign. Do you think he's going to be there for this meeting so that he can basically like run interference and take over when Biden's adrenaline shot wears off, or he starts to fall asleep or wanders off the stage in a dementia haze, because he's now like the one that has the excellent diplomatic relationship with China?
I would assume he probably will be there, or this just came to mind. Maybe that whole trip to China was like the real negotiations. And then this trip is just all for face so that the American public, thinks that Biden is still actually in control. But like they're definitely going to run Newsom. I have no doubt. And I think that this will be part of it. It'll be what he runs on. Is they'll say he has like great foreign relationships or some bullshit like that to make it a reason for why they're going to choose another white guy.
Yeah, well, like we've said, they can't fucking give it to Kamala.
Mm-hmm.
But here's what's on tap for the meeting. So White House officials are basically saying that Biden's going to try to assure Xi Jinping that we're not supporting Taiwan's independence, and the focus is going to be on maintaining this status quo of ensuring peace and stability. But we're also going to assert our dominant stance about our concerns over the CCP's, quote, unprecedented, dangerous, and provocative military actions around Taiwan. And I guess President Biden is going to ask Xi Jinping to limit the CCP's growing support for Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And I'm sure that's going to go well. And then he's also determined to reestablish military communication between the US and China. And we've talked about this on more than one episode, I think. But the CCP has basically been snubbing our military for the past 2 years and refusing to engage in any talks with our military leaders. And yet the White House seems to think that this is going to be a productive meeting, and they're so confident in their approach and our position as a leader of the world going into these talks. And like, what do you think? Like, do you think this is going to be a productive meeting that's going to open the doors to a better relationship with China?
Heck no. And they don't either. They're behind the scenes, they're all having like panic attacks right now because they know he's going to fuck it up. I mean, Biden can barely keep his eyes open. And every single time he opens his mouth, it's a catastrophe. Like, at the very least, I'm sure he's going to offend the Chinese somehow. But like, I'm more worried that this meeting is going to be kind of like a test of like China deciding if it's the right time to invade Taiwan, because I don't know, like I just can't see them waiting around knowing full well that Trump very well may be the president again pretty soon here. And like, I have zero hope that anything good is going to come from this. Like, I don't think that Biden is going to help the situation. I think he's a walking, bumbling disaster that has done nothing but destroy this country. So I don't, unfortunately, think that anything good will come from it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up, China invading Taiwan, because Rebecca Koffler, she's a strategic military analyst and a former senior official at the Defense Intelligence Agency. And she seems to think that our current situation with spreading our military resources thin while we're supporting wars in both Ukraine and Israel is basically opening the door for China to act on its ambitions to take over Taiwan. And because we're stretched so thin, we're not going to be able to do anything about it. So she did an interview with Fox News and she stated, quote, "Given that Washington is now preoccupied with two wars already, this will probably drive a change in Xi Jinping's calculus. He may assess that it's a good time to initiate offensive operations against Taiwan because the US is spread too thin, not only military capability wise, but also attention wise," end quote. Koffler also talked about the United States' lack of ability to react makes this growing instability more dangerous because we're not prepared for war with one of the world's greatest powers. And she said, we're not prepared for a multi-front war, a two-front war, or even a one-front war, if that were to happen between the US and, quote, a near peer competitor, which is a designation that the Pentagon has assigned to Russia and China. And she basically said that even though we've historically been the best warfighting force in military history, clearly we're not anymore. And she described us as currently, quote, entirely incompetent strategically, end quote. And I can't
think
say I
incompetent in like every way you can possibly come up with. I mean, and it's true. We've used so much of our stockpile on Ukraine as well as, Israel now. Like, we are going to be thin, and China knows it. They know that we're not going to have the manpower, the resources, or the funding to protect Taiwan. And let's not forget that China is patient. Like, we've talked before about how they've been playing the long game with their men infiltrating the US for decades now. We know that they've taken advantage of the wide open border. And then, the situation of us funding two wars and having a weak president, like, you better believe they're going to take advantage of that. And let's not forget, too, BRICS. What is BRICS? It's Russia, it's China, it's Iran. They're all going to band together. And think about it from their perspective. Like, this is their opportunity to make their currency the world dominant currency. You don't think they're going to take advantage of that and like get the United States while we're down? I mean, and that's what I like. I don't even think it's going to be like a nuclear fight or anything like that. It's going to be an economic one. They will destroy the United States by destroying the US dollar. And that's what I think is going to happen. But speaking of China, I do have a positive story that I wanted to talk about from a town called Green Charter Township in Michigan. This town all got together and they ousted their entire township board because the board approved a China-owned battery plant to open up in the town. And the people were outraged, and they used this as like an opportunity to organize and kick out all of the board members. So I wanted to bring it up because we always like feel so hopeless. Like, what are we going to do about it? But I think that this just goes to show, like, don't just complain about it. Like, even if you're in a small town like this one, you can get together and organize and do something about it. And like, change is possible. And the best thing we can do is focus that time and that energy at the local level. And if we all did that in our local communities, like, imagine how many things we could get done. So I thought it was a refreshing, positive story for once about China.
And I love your positive attitude. It's so inspiring. And I truly love that they did this. And I just hope it's not too late because, as you just said, China's basically infiltrated the US already. And as awesome as this is, we may be too far gone. But I totally almost forgot to mention this. Did you see there was a Washington Post report, and they basically said that Ukraine was involved in sabotaging the Nord Stream pipeline. And the report was about a senior military officer named Roman Chervinsky, and they're saying that he's allegedly responsible for coordinating the sabotage operation because he was in charge of logistics and support for this 6-person team that carried out the attack and planted the explosive charges on the pipeline. And it was saying they used a sailboat operating under a false identity to do this whole thing. And the report also alleges that Chervinsky took his orders from General Valery Zaluzny. Zaluzny, I'm not sure, who's Ukraine's highest ranking military officer. You would think that now that I'm starting to learn Czech that I'd be able to pronounce this stuff better, but I'm not there yet.
This is a hard language.
Oh my God. I don't know about Ukrainian, but Czech is a very hard language, whole other story. But anyway, Chervinsky is denying responsibility for the attack. And he's saying that he's being blamed because he's being persecuted for openly criticizing Zelensky. So, a few months ago, it came out that the Biden administration had US Navy divers plant explosives and blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, right? So was it us or was it Ukraine? Are we ever going to know the real story?
No, we're never going to get the real story, just like we never get accountability. I mean, when have we ever heard the real truth, or have they ever come out and said hey, this is what actually happened, we got it wrong? They're just going to keep burying these stories with distractions. And there's a lot of distractions right now. Notice how we haven't heard a peep about Maui or really anything for that matter ever since this war broke out with Israel. It's a huge distraction. And there's so many things going on. It's easy for people to just forget and focus on the next set of problems. So I think that we'll forget about it. Most people will, but Russia, they're not going to forget about it. They know exactly what's going on. And so does China and the rest of the world. And, unfortunately, I don't think the truth will ever come out.
Yeah, probably not. But okay. I can't even say this without laughing. Okay, I have to tell you this story. It's totally unrelated to anything that we're talking about, but we've talked about all this scary AI shit before. And so I want to end today's episode with this little story. So this article caught my attention because it was titled, quote, "Robot grabs, then brutally slaughters worker, allegedly mistaking him for a box of paprika." That was the title of the article, and I was like, holy shit.
How do you mistake a human being for paprika?
That's a great question. So this article was in the Blaze over the weekend, and it's this man from South Korea who died last Tuesday. He was in his 40s, and he was apparently attempting to diagnose an issue with the robot sensors. And it was at this place called the Dongseong Export Agricultural Complex in the southern county of Goseong. And I guess there was an equipment test that was planned for later in the week. So according to the article, quote, "The paprika sorting robot, reportedly created and installed by the victim's employer, spotted the man with his sensors, figured him for a box of vegetables, then seized him using its arms and tongs. After grabbing the technician, the robot apparently smashed him against a conveyor belt. According to the Korean language Yonhap news agency, the victim's face and chest were crushed. He was taken to the hospital where he later died." End quote.
Where he later died. So he was alive during this whole
incident? Yes, while being mutilated and destroyed by a robot, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah, and the article goes on to talk about how like South Korea has the highest industrial robot density in the world by like a huge margin. And a lot of it has to do with the rising costs of minimum wage and how they've made robots price competitive. And the article gave an example that like a robotic chef can fry 50 chickens in an hour or cook up spicy rice cakes for 5 people in under 10 minutes, which I guess humans can't do at that same capacity. And according to police, they're saying like the murdering robot wasn't like an advanced or highly sophisticated AI robot. And they're suggesting that the robot might have snatched up the man because he possibly had like a box of paprika in his hand. But either way, like, I know I was laughing in the beginning, but it's a very tragic story and it's very disturbing. And it's like yet another warning of the dangers of robots and AI.
Yeah. Like, I feel like a new fear just unlocked in me. Like, this reminds me of something you'd see on an episode of Black Mirror. Like,
Yeah.
just, I think I'm gonna have nightmares from that. And then it's like, okay, so this guy was killed, but then is anyone gonna be held accountable? Because it was a robot. Like,
Yeah.
does the guy who made the robot, like, is he accountable? Like, because this could totally be a way that people like murder someone if you just set a robot to go do it. Like, what the hell? Like, this is so creepy.
And if this is a robot that's not even like one with the advanced knowledge,
Yeah.
and it's doing this, like it's the whole thing. They've robots freak me out, and this whole AI shit freaks me out. And like, I don't want to go to a restaurant where a robot's fucking cooking up my chicken.
No, no, I don't think they should be making robots or like make them small. Why are we making big robots? Like, that is
Right.
just asking for like the Terminator to happen. So weird. Oh my gosh. Okay, well,
Yeah.
that's gonna stick with me now. Thanks for unleashing that fear.
Mhm. Happy Monday.
Oh man, yeah, we need to do like a whole episode on AI again because I'm sure that we could dig up a ton of crazy stories like that.
Oh, I guarantee it. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm sure everyone's totally freaked out now, but at the same time, it's going to be an interesting story you could go tell your friends this week. So, everyone have a great week and we'll see you next time on